Welcome to CogX 2020, brought to you in some unusual circumstances, but I hope you agree this will be a very exciting 3 days. The programme is absolutely splendid. We've got over 1,000 speakers. We have got 400 talks underway, and I'm very glad that you've joined us on one of the 18 stages, the very special stage, which is the summit stage. We are going to kick off, we're running a few minutes late, but we're going to kick off with our very first session, which is big government or effective government. We ask the government to solve an ever-increasing number of problems. Its reach has expanded, particularly in the time of coronavirus, and so has its size. But does big government actually equate to good government, or is there a better way in the digital age? Ed Vaizey is a senior partner at FTI Consulting, and he's also the former Tech and Culture Minister, and he's going to be guiding you through the conversation with some special speakers.
I'm here to moderate the session that we have coming up today on big government versus effective government. I'm not sure whether it's a suitable juxtaposition. We have four wonderful guests with us today. The first up is Hanna Johnson. Now, you'll detect a theme as I introduce people of sort of getting the band together, because Hanna worked for me as my private secretary when I was a minister. And then, unfortunately, I had to demote her, and she went to work as the private secretary to the Prime Minister, David Cameron. And from there, she's gone on to a stellar career in the private sector and is now the Chief Operating Officer of Public. And Public was founded by a guy called Dan Korski, among others, who used to work as a technology advisor in number 10 Downing Street. And what it does, it incubates and supports companies that want to, tech companies and tech startups that want to provide new digital solutions to government. It's a fantastic resource for Whitehall and a fantastic resort for governments all over the world. Then I have Lisa Witter, who is the co-founder and I think the executive chairman of Apolitical. And I've followed Lisa around the world. I've watched her speak in Barcelona on digital government, and then I've watched her speak in Davos on digital government, and now here she is in her office in Berlin speaking to us in London at the largest digital leadership tech conference in the world. So I'm third time lucky with Lisa, and Lisa's company connects people working in digital government all around the world so they don't reinvent the wheel. They can seek help and advice from others who have been and done it before. Talking of which, we have Mike Bracken. Mike is the founder of Public Digital. This is not to be confused with Hanna's company, which is called Public. Mike's is called Public Digital, and Mike ran the government digital service when I was a minister. And although I wasn't responsible for the government digital service, I came across Mike a lot, was very supportive of his work, and he and his team put the UK at #1 in terms of effective delivery of government services digitally. And since Mike left, all of that has gone to pot. It's absolutely rubbish. We need Mike back in government. That's never going to happen, unfortunately, but he is a brilliant man who will tell us what government should be doing. And finally, we have Jimmy McLoughlin, OBE. Now, Jimmy is currently unemployed, which is not a surprise because he used to work for Theresa May. He used to be her business and technology advisor. But actually, he's unemployed through choice because his wonderful wife is working hard in the NHS during the COVID crisis. And Jimmy and she just returned from Jimmy's 3 months at Stanford University, and he's put his career on hold so his wife can go back to the NHS. But you can't get away from Jimmy, because if you can download the Times app, which I can't, I'm currently in dispute with the Times about how on earth you can get access to their app after you've paid them a lot of money. But if you do manage to get access, you'll read Jimmy's regular columns on what government should do. And you'll also, if you're clever like me, have subscribed to Jimmy's regular newsletter, giving businesses advice during the COVID crisis. Mike looks like he's already fallen asleep during that very, very long introduction. So I'm going to kick off the discussion. Now, I curated this team of wonderful people, so I'm responsible for wasting an hour of their time, but it won't be a waste of time for anyone who's watching this. And I'm also responsible for the title of this discussion, which is Big Government versus Effective Government. And really what it is, it's shorthand for saying that, in my view, the COVID pandemic crisis that we've been through is an opportunity for government to look again at how it provides digital services. I think when the crisis started, there was a big feeling that somehow big government was back. Rishi Sunak spending £300 billion to support businesses, effectively literally half the workforce now being paid for by the government, companies being requisitioned to make ventilators, suddenly government intervention in a very big way, the biggest way since the Second World War, possibly bigger even than the Second World War, was back on the agenda. But my counter argument to that, if we ever come out of this pandemic, is that given that money is going to be extremely tight and difficult to come by, there has never been a better time for government to completely reimagine how it delivers public services. My brief overview of the government digital service when I was a minister tells me that where there's a will, there is a way. It is possible to do it. So what we've got in this carefully curated panel is from Hanna. We've got an overview of the kind of companies that can make a difference. From Lisa and Mike, we've got an overview of what governments all over the world are doing, particularly those that have now overtaken the UK. And from Jimmy, we've got an insider's view as well on how difficult it is to rearrange the deck chairs in Whitehall. Hanna, I just want to start with you. I just want to ask you a bit about what you've seen over the last 3 months. You have a great overview of some of the startups and companies that are providing fantastic services to government. What I always found as the technology minister was that it was brilliant to engage with startups because they were the ones, the canaries in the mine, if you like, thinking originally about how to deliver services. So what are the ones that have stood out for you, and how are you finding engaging with government at this difficult time?
Great, thanks, Ed. I mean, the last couple of months have been a breaking down of barriers, you could say. Government working, looking for every way of fixing some of the problems that they're facing. One of the things that we've been involved with has been the Tech Force 19 programme with NHSX, which put out a call for help meeting some of the challenges that the NHS was going to have in more of a kind of social setting. So helping people with their mental health, helping with remote social care, and helping to fix staffing problems. We got that up and running in 5 days. We had applications open for, I think, 3 or 4 days, and we had 1,600 applications. And it was really a window onto, I think, for government onto the great ecosystem that is out there already working and has solutions for some of the problems they're trying to fix in the market. And we've seen that in the broader sense as well. Patchwork, which is a platform which helps with temporary staffing, has helped to launch the London Staff Bank, which brings together across all of the London hospitals. It's broken down barriers between those hospitals to have a common staffing bank so that we can staff up for COVID effectively. Care, which is a technology-enabled care company working with NHS to quickly recruit and to train and to deploy carers in social care, where we've seen a need for more workers as well. So there is, I think it's been a real opening of the window onto the tech ecosystem. It's been a breaking down of the difficulties that government has had kind of engaging with startups, and we've seen some really fantastic results.
So what motivates the kind of founders that come to visit public? What it strikes me is if you wanted to start a company, the last sort of company you'd want to start would be one that had to work with government, because it's such an impossible place to navigate.
You would be right there, Ed. I think the common thread that we see with all of the founders that we work with is a real mission-driven approach. And in particular, we see a lot of founders in tech who have frontline experience. A lot of the health tech companies, for example, I mentioned Patchwork just then. Anas, who is the founder and CEO, is a doctor. He still works in the NHS. And so it's often people who have seen issues firsthand, have identified a problem through their own working life and have built a solution to fix it, working off personal experience.
Brilliant. So some of that came through and some of it didn't. I should explain I used to be the telecoms minister. So if anyone can't get a proper connection onto this call, please blame me. Lisa, I want to ask you what you've seen in the last 3 months. You've got an overview all around the world of what people are working on. You connect people from different governments with each other. What have you seen in terms of which governments are engaging the best, and what people are learning from each other during this crisis? What are the themes that are sort of emerging?
Well, just to piggyback off of Hanna's conversations into those themes, as a startup in this space, as a startup co-founder in this space, that also we're very lucky to have Public as one of our investors. The other thing we care a lot about is scale. And nowhere in the world can you have scale in the way you can with government, which is why government has gotten so big. We're seeing a lot of really exciting things in government right now. So we've been doing tracking polling from the very beginning of the COVID time, week by week, asking folks sort of what they need. And some of the things that we're seeing is, number one, right when COVID came out, there was more anxiety. Public servants had more anxiety about the impact on society than they did on their own families or themselves. So very mission-driven people inside of government. They've been quickly trying to figure out how to work from home, like all of us have, and digitizing services and making sure that there's lots of coordinated information have been quite important. As we talk about digitization, though, we asked recently, last week, what are, of all the policy and knowledge that you need to move forward past COVID-19, out of 100%, 25% said data and digitization as sort of policies and practices, and 19% said 21st century skills, followed by 18% supporting vulnerable populations. So there's a big need we're seeing in government around this push. We're hearing a lot from folks running digital teams that this has finally been the push to get their governments to say, hey, we really need to digitize. With that said, I'm sitting here from talking to you in Germany, and the Germans decided they are making an app around COVID tracing, but they also started right away with the human touch. So I think while there's a drive to digitization where it makes sense, people are also saying there may be some things where we still need to use kind of older methods to do things. So we're seeing innovations happen from Africa to the US to the UK. And I think this is going to be a golden time for digital. And just to bridge back to the frame, what sort of government do we have, effective or big? I'm seeing, and as an American watching what's going on with the racial issues and protests in the US, we're seeing across that public servants are wanting a more responsive government. So how do you become more agile and responsive to crises and just changes? And then a facilitative government, like Hanna was saying, how do we facilitate folks in the private sector to be able to meet the needs of citizens? So I'm really bullish that this is an exciting time for government.
Brilliant. Well, Mike Bracken, bullish is your middle name, and you did a lot of work with the UK government, and you've taken that skill set and you now work with governments all over the world. Everyone here has been working in the space long before the pandemic. Who are you seeing who are the real innovators who are going to really transform, where government really genuinely gets it, leaving aside the obvious suspects like Estonia?
Obviously, all governments are different and all contexts are different, but the major, I think the government, whether they be national or large regional governments, who are going to make interesting moves as a result of this, who are the ones who recognise early on that the current playbook and the current mechanisms of government are just not fit for purpose, and who question their own setup. Because what we really see is some sort of demand side responses. People wanting, as these were saying, more agility, more more responsiveness. That's all well and good, but if you're still using the same structure in government and machinery in government as you have been for the last 10, 20, 30 years, you're not going to get that, because governments by and large, particularly in the Whitehall model, and democratic governments are by and large are a product of a manufacturing age, and we're not in a manufacturing age anymore, we're in a digital age, and consequently how you structure your service delivery around networks rather than hierarchies is the game in town. So I see interesting moves being made on structures of government, by some interesting government. So in California, Gavin Newsom, who's the governor, facing a huge budget deficit, been very clear in his speech last week that the machinery of government is going to have to change, and that's definitely one to watch. That's 40 million people. In countries like Peru, where their legislature changed very quickly to enable telehealth working, and brushed away sort of decades of tramitas and other public service legislative processes. We see a country very quick to understand that the way it's set up isn't really going to help meet current crises and make changes that aren't just a response to COVID, but a response to sort of rapid delivery of service. I see an awful lot of interest in cities who will make moves. I think the UK has been particularly slow in that respect. And I see actually smaller countries who are not really burdened or don't really have the inertia that comes with large clashing federated systems of governments, national, local and regional, move quickly. I think you'll see countries like Uruguay, Argentina, some of the Asian countries, obviously Korea, got a very centralized country there. So it's piecemeal. You can't just point at one country and say they've got the model, because the context is everything. But the thing that connects the countries making interesting moves are the ones that are looking at how they're set up, the machinery of government, and recognizing this is essentially a supply side problem. This is how we're set up, and all the goodwill in the world, all the external providers of services and solutions and whatever, require government to change how governments work to enable them to play a bigger role. And it's basically, we need politicians and heads of government who are looking at the machinery of government afresh and going, right, are we set up right here? You yourself, Ed, when we would talk in government, would talk about the perils of departmentalism in the UK, for instance. Like, why on earth would you even want a department now? And I think that politicians who are thinking that openly and broadly about the structures of government are the ones to watch.
Great, thank you for that. And Jimmy, that brings us neatly to you, because you had to wrestle with the structures of the government. I can imagine you saw it in spades. I certainly felt as a minister that departments were terrible fiefdoms, and if an idea wasn't invented in a department, it never got anywhere within that department. You had to try and bring departments together when you were in number 10, and you had the whole technology agenda. You were seeing the incoming from, as it were, the private sector and the innovation that was happening there. And presumably you were seeing the potential outgoing in terms of how that could influence how government went about its business. How did you navigate that relationship? I mean, there was a lot of progress in terms of working with the private sector, for example, data centers and so on, but it must have been a bit of an uphill struggle.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think, credit to Mike and the team over the last decade, the UK has made good strides, but it is incredibly problematic because the system of government is so big in the UK already, and it's only going to get bigger, as you say, with probably increased taxes after the coronavirus to pay for the splurge of public spending that we're having. So government is going to get bigger, but it also needs to get more effective in the way that it does these things. I actually do think, from a UK specific point of view, that sort of Brexit provides a bit of an opportunity with some of this stuff, because we're going to have to design a whole load of new systems. For example, when it comes to immigration, half of our immigration policy had essentially been subcontracted to the European Union. Actually having to design something like that from scratch again, whilst daunting, does mean that we don't have necessarily the legacy systems, which can be so much of the inertia problem that Mike was talking about. So I do think the UK is quite well positioned to take advantage of it, but it's also difficult for startups and scale-ups to know whereabouts to go in government. It's incredibly difficult, and there is often quite a lot of passing the sort of buck from department to department. You should go and speak to them and so forth, and that does make it hard. But it is paramount that technology leaders that are here at this conference today get out there and engage with the government more and try and explain some of the things that are happening, because it's moving so fast, and every few months there are new tools that are being created which can improve government productivity. And there are some examples of where AI is kind of working with National Grid on their drones, and now all sort of 7,200 miles of overhead lines are checked by drones, which is reducing the amount of call outs that are needed. So these things are happening, but it's just incumbent on the kind of private sector spot more where they can happen and kind of give the government the options how to take advantage of them as quickly as possible, because government's going to need all the help that it can get in the next few years.
So I've thank you all very much for your sort of introductions, obviously provoked by my thoughtful and intelligent questions. I just some brilliant themes have come out from this talk, some of which I wasn't particularly expecting, and some of which I want to try and bring alive. One of the things that interests me, it's a slightly tangential point that Lisa mentioned, is this idea of working from home. I mean, without trying to kind of extrapolate it too much, I was very struck a few weeks ago talking to BT about how they had managed to move all their call center operators to work from home. That was something like 8,000 people. And one of the things that prevents them from doing that, apart from the infrastructure, are the regulations. Because if I was a call center operator now and my wife walked in, she could look at whoever's bill I had on my computer, and that's obviously not something that's suboptimal. But I wonder, Lisa, if you could develop that theme, because it strikes me as, when we're talking about equality, for example, the opportunity for government employees to work from home and to use technology in that way strikes me as one of the kind of side effects, if you like, of digital government. Is that a trend that you think will grow and increase the opportunities for people to work in a much more flexible way?
Yeah, I absolutely do, and I think that this is there are a lot of great things about this. We knew right when we went out with polling to public servants that working from home was going to be an issue. We didn't realize how big of an issue it would be, and this is where it became an issue. One is that public servants didn't necessarily have the technology at home. Two, so many of different governments' servers were getting sort of overloaded with the demand that there was a real broadband, real sort of pipe issue for a lot of governments. And teams inside of government hadn't ever spent time working this way before and running meetings this way. So we ran a number of online courses to teach folks in government how to work better together. And it goes to my main point, is that when we talk about government, one, a lot of times people can't separate the politicians from the civil servants. But number two, government is just made of people like Mike or Jimmy or you, Ed, or myself or Hannah. We're all just people. And none of the looking forward in 10 years is going to get any better unless we invest in upskilling and supporting our public servants. I mean, at Apolitical, we've been even doing things like providing yoga, which has been massively popular. And we thought, oh God, we were sheepish about putting it out there, like, oh, we won't be seen as serious. And it's massively popular because public servants have those mental and emotional needs as well. So I see a lot of what's going on as a great democratizing opportunity to engage more diverse and different types of people.
Brilliant. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing Boris Johnson's downward dog imminently. Hanna, Jimmy mentioned the point that, his sort of shout out to startups to engage with government. I mean, you talked in your opening remarks about some of the NHS, the companies that are focused on the NHS. And I remember back in the day talking to people like Dido Harding when, because I still get obviously the odd startup coming to me thinking this guy's a politician, he can help me get my brilliant idea adopted by 1 million NHS workers. I mean, how easy is it if you've got a potentially revolutionary idea? It's extremely difficult to get any kind of sense that it could be adopted very quickly. It's one of the reasons, obviously, why the incumbents often win the day. But if you've got a great startup, it's very, very hard to get scale up within government, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. And this kind of period has been a way of working differently in some ways, bringing things through procurement very quickly, working on several different solutions at once to see which one will work best and then scaling that. We have to hope that that's something that gets adopted going forward, because when we go back to peacetime, so to speak, you need to change. There are changes that need to happen to the way that programs are developed and delivered and procured to make sure that you can access those new technologies. Otherwise, if we go back to the old world where it's a big a big program with a procurement process that doesn't mean you can access it as a small company, then you won't get that innovation in.
I mean, I was just thinking of parallel. I remember going to a hospital once. I had a slew of constituent cases where elderly patients had to wait at hospital for 8 hours because what happened was the doctor wrote the physical prescription and it went down. It took all day to get to the hospital pharmacist. So people couldn't pick up their prescription until the end of the day. Now, if you were running an Amazon warehouse and you decided to introduce new technology to make it easier for the supervisor to log product on an iPad effectively, that would probably happen within a week across all of Amazon's warehouses, but it wouldn't happen for multiple years in the NHS.
Yeah, and I mean, I think going back to Lisa's point, some of the issue is about capability and skills. Some of it is about how programs and procurements are designed. You know, if you read the Treasury Green Book, I think it mentions the word digital once, and it actively says that you should pursue existing and kind of legacy technologies so long as that reduces the risk. The kind of attitude to risk in the public sector is still, you know, very old, and favouring bigger, longer contracts doesn't help new innovators to get access to some of those things.
I remember Francis Moore talking about how he wanted to have the annual awards for failure for the civil service to encourage civil servants to take more risks. It's probably an idea that he stole off Mike Bracken. But Mike, can I ask you, I think it was Lisa as well that mentioned, or Jimmy that mentioned data. Can you bring alive data for us? I mean, it's something that people, including me, sort of, it trips off the tongue. Well, we need to share data. We need to do more with data. It's one of those really boring things, but it seems to me it sort of underpins everything that government can effectively deliver, the better use and sharing of data.
Sure. So I became, I think, the UK's first chief data officer in, can't remember, 2014. And really it was after 4 years of very hard work on services, because it was the next necessary set of reforms. And for a variety of reasons, didn't really get the opportunity to continue those reforms. And they've sort of gone backwards. But essentially, I think that most governments face two problems with that, why it's so important. Firstly, data is intrinsically tied up with this perennial problem of how government structures itself. So in the United Kingdom, we have a legacy of new public management, which is how we're structured. So we have many different types of government organisations, non-departmental public bodies, trading funds, agencies, departments, so on and so forth, research institutes funded under the Haldane Agreement. It's all quite balkanised. And what that means is, by and large, is that data becomes a trading asset that is there often to protect the sovereignty of the department. You can't have my data because of X. You can't have it because of legislative complaints, or you can't have it because I trade money for it, or I charge funds to access it, or I have a monopolistic arrangement with it, or I have a supplier who owns it. And therefore our data architecture and systems are just simply not set up. And most countries have got this problem. And what's required in the same way, I think, that we looked at services for a good 4 or 5 years is the same look at data. And when you look at government data, how it flows, and I wouldn't advise you do that in the United Kingdom because it's not particularly pretty, what you'll see is an awful lot of side arrangements, often made tactically to suit a need that people have now forgotten many years ago, and that data is flowing, to use an inappropriate phrase, data is being shifted from one area of government to another for no real reason in the way it's moving. And the mechanisms for data exchange are multiple, and they are often not fit for purpose anymore. It's not a good position. So I don't know. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people recently. I don't know in detail, but I suspect one of the major issues is that the many balkanised parts of the NHS simply cannot talk to each other because they don't have a central guiding hand on data standards. So if you have NHSX, E, I, all the other acronyms, that's great. And they were set up with very good intent in the last 10 years and largely as a result of the land theory reform. And yet there was absolutely no focus on common data standards and interoperability. In fact, one of the reasons why GES exists, I think, is that in the fag end of the last Labour government, they'd spent £10 million on the NHS spine and the big procurement that haven't really got us anywhere. So our data is the first thing to recognise is data in and of itself is not neutral. It is it shares the characteristic of the organisation through which it flows, and that organisation isn't fit for purpose. So to fix data, you have to fix sovereignty of government, and you have to invest in people and organisations who have the responsibility for the maintenance of data. One of the things we try to do, and we did to some degree, is focus on canonical registries of data. So the old idea that you have single registrars, people who are responsible to Parliament for the maintenance and upkeep and sharing of data sets, should have a much more strengthened role in a digital economy. We really should have that. We really do need that. And many countries are in similar states because they've not addressed their data estate for 10, 20 years. And you see actually with the more autocratic states how they're able to move quickly because they simply don't have put these sort of barriers in place of their own delivery mechanism.
Brilliant. Jimmy, I don't know if you want to comment to a certain extent on that, this ongoing theme of organisation, fiefdoms. I mean, I used to, in the days when I went to dinner parties, and you can imagine what scintillating company I was, that, if I was king for a day, I would abolish every government department and set up government by task. I mean, your problem, I guess, was that when you were in number 10, the all-consuming issue was Brexit, and the chance to breathe and think about any of this stuff in a wider context was extremely difficult. But don't you think that, he says with a leading question, that kind of Mike is completely right here, that one of the reasons we seem to find it so difficult to get things done is because of this Balkan, we exist with these Victorian structures in Whitehall.
Yeah, I think that's true to a certain extent. But the opportunity, I think, is that coronavirus and Brexit to a certain extent as well are just two sort of shock events that weren't sort of, really on the radar 5 years ago of government. And that's going to force government into change. And, even the points at the beginning about working from home and so on, I mean, that was incredibly difficult to do on the kind of Downing Street systems, for example. And part of that's tied up with security. But actually, there is a real risk aversion culture in Whitehall. Because people can always find a reason not to do something. There can always be something that can be found that then ends up putting the brakes on something from happening. Whereas I think actually coronavirus is going to change all that. It's forcing people into change. And I think you've seen this a lot in the corporate sector as well. It's not just a government thing, but now entire offices being able to work from home and so on. I'm sceptical about whether that transcends actually into the long term of people working from home. But that forced change, I think, could be really beneficial for governments. And a lot of it can be just about small changes that need to happen. Sometimes politicians can get sort of slightly caught up in grand visions and speeches of that regard, whereas actually it's just the sort of small tweaks that you need to make of incremental improvement. And lots of that is happening and was even happening during the kind of Brexit years. But you're right, it's very tough. It was tough when I was there to kind of force that change just because of the focus of it. But yeah, there are lots of small incremental changes happening across government, and I think there's even more of those are going to happen because of the forced changes that come in from the response to the pandemic.
Ed?
So I've got a few, yes, Mike.
I know I'm going out of turn. Can I just respond to that, just to liven the debate up? I think that's evidently wrong. I think, coronavirus will not change government's approach to data. The reason it won't do that is because it hasn't changed through foot and mouth, SARS, MERS, Brexit, swine flu. You keep naming them. We have a system in the UK whereby, let's take businesses. We have an institution at Companies House that does keep the record of businesses in the UK. Everyone who has a business will know that. And yet HMRC, who taxes those businesses, won't even use the same record because they're unique and special and different. Even the most basic things like addresses and land management, we cannot get parts of government to agree to share and use the same data. So the idea that coronavirus is going to make it is just I hope you're right, Ed, but it's like shock after shock has happened and it never changes. And the reason it doesn't change is not because coronavirus isn't important. The reason it doesn't change is that there's never the alignment of political engagement and the necessity of changing the government machine. And one of the things that about hark back to GDS, it was there because you had alignment right from the top all the way through, with the cabinet secretary all the way through to the system. And I think we'll only see substantial changes if we have that alignment, and that alignment is accepted by the public. And I think we're miles away from that. We're actually going backwards. I mean, we have just demonstrated for 10 years in this country that we're very good at creating digital products and services which involve the co-creation with public servants, and then we give our test and trace app to Serco. I mean, at some point, we have to have a quick look at ourselves and go, are we learning much here? So if we're still pulling stunts like that, then the idea that we're now going to change our entire data infrastructure and management techniques around coronavirus, I think is, how can I put it, highly optimistic.
Yeah.
Jimmy, you've set people off, and now Lisa wants to come in as well.
Well, it's fun. Just the Brits I've learned working with Brits, you always like to be really hard on yourselves. It's kind of the way you do things. So I just want to say from the outside in, there has been great leadership from the UK, and there is actually innovation going on that will stay in data. I mean, if you're looking at some of the things the Bureau of Statistics are doing, there's some really great public-private partnership information on data. That is definitely happening. I hear you though, Mike Bracken, that to have the big reform that is necessary, things have to often get much harder, number one. And number two, there has to be political alignment. I mean, if you want to look at an example of somewhere around the world that's done this really well, Portugal, which is a country that has basically no money, has done a massive job at making these pieces of alignment. A citizen never has to give the same amount of the same piece of data to a different agency twice, right? They put the citizens at the center of this. So there are things that we can look at, but I wanted to bridge with that to none of these things will change in a big way if the citizens aren't in some way behind you. And Edelman, who puts out their annual trust barometer, did a May update of it, and trust in government in the UK was up 26% in May because of Corona, and up 9% in the US. And these are both countries where you could say have not probably handled it as well as places like Germany, where I'm sitting in. And that trust gap has grown even higher in local government. So just to pause it out there, I'm wondering if what Corona means is less focus and obsession with national governments and prime ministers and presidents and all of that, and much more flipping it. So the federal government is in service and facilitative of the things that need to happen in local communities. I mean, you go outside of London and the poverty levels, and I don't need to tell you all of this. So I'm hoping that the politicians and public servants can take this trust reservoir and really do the exciting yet sometimes boring reforms necessary. There's my rant.
Look, we've only got a short period of time left, and I for one have found this absolutely fascinating, this discussion. Lisa has mentioned, said the word boring, and in fact on our chat she says that Apolitical sponsors, I think this may be tongue-in-cheek, but sponsors the boring awards. For some reason, I really get off on government tech reform, but I agree a lot of what makes it happen is extremely dull. So we're going to liven it up. I've loved the discussion so far, but we're going to carry on livening it up with some comments from people who are apparently watching this incredible discussion. Some positive news, and I would sort of echo this. Somebody has pointed out that DWP has had a tech upgrade. By the way, any of you on the panel, please feel free to come in and comment on this. DWP has had a tech upgrade which has worked perfectly, and to a certain extent, I would echo that in the sense that, as far as I'm aware, universal credit, which is the benefit that everyone in the UK gets, was the dog that didn't bark, and everybody unfortunately had to take universal credit because of job losses. My understanding is that instead of queues around the block at the job centre, the vast majority of people were able to access universal credit online and were able to access it smoothly. I don't know if anyone has any insight into that.
Mm-hmm. I think.
Anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, Neil Cooling and his team it's a perfect model. I think they deserve a huge amount of credit. One of the reasons they have scaled is that they were designed to scale, and that when we reset universal credit after the sort of big IT fiasco in, I don't know, 14 or so, whatever it was, that team has quietly been doing the right thing for a long time. So they've been working with users, they've been growing incrementally, they've been learning as they go, but the technology platform and the way that they've architected themselves is second to none. It was built for times like this. It's built to work remotely. It scales really well. Nothing's ever perfect. I'm sure there are things it needs to do that, but you're absolutely right. It's the dog that doesn't bark. I mean, you don't find people working in those teams who are sort of knocking out Excel spreadsheets every day and working in those old ways. They were just adopted digital internet era ways of working, 5-6 years ago, and have been given to DWP's tremendous credit the ability to continue doing that through sometimes difficult political waters. So they're a good model. I think what there is quite a binary thing here. You'll find government organisations particularly struggle to scale because they haven't done an awful lot of very small basic stuff for the last 5 years. You can't suddenly flip into a new way of working. Like, there's an awful lot of organisations that are finding themselves in beta at the moment, and they just didn't want to be there because they haven't done an awful lot of things. They haven't embraced the cloud. They haven't do everything in a browser. They're still practicing perimeter security. They're using a load of old techniques which really need to be replaced. Each one of them isn't sort of scandalous that you didn't do it, but collectively it doesn't set you up for working in this way.
Can I just pick up as well on moving from the national to the local? Somebody's asked the question about what is going to happen regionally, what will happen about government departments moving north, and to a certain extent they're separate questions, but I want to echo what both Mike said very early on in the discussion about when he was talking about context, and I didn't pick him up on it because it's an interesting point about how some cities and indeed US states are pioneers, and Lisa just talked about local government and the trust level of local government and the opportunity for local government to provide services. And Jimmy, I know, is also interested in that topic. Can you talk a bit about what digital does mean for both, local services delivered locally, and also it is a perennial issue about government being too London-centric, the opportunity for government to become more national, perhaps ironically, physically more national through digital, if that doesn't sound too confusing.
Maybe
Jimmy, you're interested in the local government point? Hanna?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think local government, on the whole, you come at it from your own experiences, but mine in Wandsworth, I can do almost all of it online, my services and so on. And so I think they've made a real breakthrough with that. I think there's a challenge in terms of, the government has talked about post the election sort of moving a lot more things kind of into the north of England, which is a bit of a generic term, I find, really. But I think that actually with the flexibility in working, that will probably happen more by default anyway. So I think that's encouraging because it's going to allow for that to happen. But the opportunity for local government is very interesting, I think, around this, because there has also been this sort of revival of community spirit. I think a lot of us have seen. I saw the piece in The Guardian a few days ago saying 80% of people felt closer with neighbours and so on. And I think that is an enormous opportunity local government should really try and capitalise on and get people a bit more involved with their local government and explain what it does, because to a lot of people it's all tied in with the national government, and they don't necessarily make the sort of divisions of what the national and local government does. So I think this is a really big opportunity for local government.
Hanna, you were going to come in as well.
I agree with all the things Jimmy said there about local government and local community. I think just on the point about working remotely, with government departments now, I think some of them telling their staff don't expect to be back in the office until December, and having proven that they can work, particularly all departments who are very London-centric, that they can work remotely, they can work with ministers, even if they're not sited around the corner from Parliament. It is a big opportunity to think of the civil service, particularly being less London-centric, moving, to be more representative of the country at large. We've found ways of working now that can work, so let's keep them. and try to be a bit more location neutral, and hope that Parliament also decides to go back to being a bit more leading by example, perhaps.
Well, I was going to say, one of my questions was going to be Jacob Rees-Mogg, digital hero or antediluvian 19th century throwback. But perhaps a more relevant question for this panel would be NHSX, fabulous success story or missed opportunity? Jimmy, you've already got your OBE. You can say what you think.
Look, I think
there was a question from one of the audience about what we think about how NHSX has performed.
Yeah, look, I think NHSX has been a fabulous success. And yes, there have been problems around track and trace, obviously, but it just goes to the point about how we need civil servants to be taking more risk. I think the individuals that are in there are brilliant, and frankly, I would like to see a kind of DWPX and every other department to have an X which allows people as a front door, allows innovators to go in and speak to the right people. And I know that, Hanna, you've done that with public, and it's been a pretty big success over the last few weeks. And I would like to see it replicated across more government departments.
Brilliant. Mike,
that was a very boring answer.
Mike, do you want to start a row with Jimmy about that?
Yeah, I'll start a row with Jimmy about anything. I would not like to see X in other departments, but I recognise the NHS is a particularly unique setup. I think people are doing lots of good work. My point is, look, I never criticise individuals. I think that there's a lot of people doing great work, but in structures and often with systems that are not helping them. And that my point is structural rather than personal. I think NHSX has done within the rules what it can do, and it as a new organisation, it's reacted tremendously well to this pandemic. I think it's worked well, and everything I hear from people who've worked with them is that they've worked very hard and as much as they can. NHSX cannot fix a decade-long problem of the absence of standards across the NHS and the wider health environment. That is not their job to fix. My daughter just playing.
Lisa, does every government department in the world need an X?
No, I don't think they do, and I think it depends on context. But the thing that is sitting in my mind listening to all of this, and it's one of the reasons we founded Apolitical, we did a survey of public servants during the time of COVID about how did they get evidence-based policies and ideas. And 40% of them said it costs too much time and money to go out and actually figure out what's working in other places, which that means they're going to recreate the wheel or do something that doesn't work. And 30% said they don't even know where to go get the best evidence. So I think we need to use data and more sharing. It's what we try to solve at Apolitical, to help folks in government learn from one another, in this case globally, but you can imagine, Jimmy and Hanna, we don't want each small local government starting from scratch. How can we learn from one another? If they used one of the startups to do something cool in one part of the UK, then they should learn from that for procurement for the other side. So I think we need to use data and AI to help government help itself save money, be more efficient, and put citizens at the center.
Right, Lisa, you have managed, as I expected, to get the last word, because we've got to wrap up now. We've run out of time. I think Joy is going to wrap up, but if she doesn't, I want to say that everyone apparently has to tweet about how much they've enjoyed this panel, and they have to use the hashtag CogX 2020. So let's get trending. And I just want to say you've been brilliant, and I genuinely have loved every minute of this discussion, and you've thrown up I even took notes. You've thrown up lots of brilliant thoughts and ideas. So thank you very much for giving me your time.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.